I think we are good.
And so would I just ask you to advance the next slide?
All right. So, to introduce you today is one of our students, Quentin. Come on up.
Hi.
Hi.
Uh, I'd like to give a warm welcome to this week's speaker, Dr. Adrienne Mayer, a historian of ancient science and warfare. So, Dr. Mayer received her bachelor's degree in ancient folklore from the University of Minnesota and then received her honorary doctorate of letters in 2007 from Montana State University. Throughout her career as a historian, she has written several very successful books, accruing multiple awards and honors for her publications. Her work has been featured in numerous public outlets such as NPR, BBC, the New York Times, and National Geographic. She now works as a research scholar in Stanford's History and Philosophy of Science program. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Mayer.
Thank you, Quentin. And thank you, Professor Murray, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be invited to the Andrews University Chemistry Seminar. And I just want to start off first by saying that compared to the previous talks in this series, which I've watched several of them on YouTube, my talk is not going to be quite as technical as some of your other guest speakers. My research actually asks a historical question about biological and chemical warfare. And that question is, just how ancient is the idea and the practice of biochemical warfare? When was this Pandora's box first opened? And I think the answer turns out to be kind of surprising. The roots of human beings' genius for turning natural forces into weapons, they go much deeper, a lot older than we might have imagined. Like most people, I once assumed that chemical and biological warfare must have been a relatively recent invention. Surely the ability to turn poisons, germs, chemicals, and other dangerous natural agents into weapons, wouldn't that require a scientific understanding of toxicology, biology, epidemiology, and chemistry? And plus, wouldn't you need advanced technology and sophisticated delivery systems? And besides, wasn't warfare in antiquity supposed to be based on honor, courage and bravery and battle skills? Well, we'll look at those questions in this talk. Many modern historians today have assumed that poison weapons and unscrupulous, unfair tactics of war were forbidden by ancient rules of war, and that with very few exceptions, those ancient rules of war were followed in the ancient world, and that turns out to be false. It's actually overly optimistic about human behavior. And many modern historians trace the first deliberate use of germ warfare to the Middle Ages, and some of you have probably already heard of the notorious episode in 1346 about bubonic plague. The story goes that when the Mongols were besieging the fortified city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in the Crimea, that Mongol army suffered the epidemic of black plague, bubonic plague, and the report was that they catapulted the plague diseased corpses of their own soldiers over the walls with the intention of spreading the plague among the enemy. Now, it's not been proven whether that really happened or not, but it's plausible it could have happened. And I just want to point out that if it did happen, that tactic would have required no formal scientific knowledge. Everyone in that time period and earlier knew that proximity to victims of plague or even touching their clothing or being near their belongings would spell doom. And here I think you can just go to the next slide. But actually do have some much older evidence of knowledge of how contagion worked. Goes back almost 4,000 years. We have ancient Sumerian and Hittite cuneiform tablets that demonstrate a practical understanding of contagion. And these tablets go back to about 1700 BC. These tablets warn against touching the belongings of plague victims. And some of the tablets even describe sending infected animals, like donkeys or cattle, and even victims of epidemics into enemy lands, to devastate enemy lands. So as I looked further into the ancient literature seeking the roots of biochemical warfare, I learned that ways of turning nature's armory to military use were not just imagined, but actually practiced much earlier and more extensively in the ancient world than has been realized so far. There were no standard rules of war in the ancient world, as I mentioned. But it does turn out that ancient attitudes about gaining unfair advantage with poisons and other sinister weapons were complex and ambivalent. So underhanded secret strategies to try to avoid face-to-face combat entailed practical and ethical problems. And that realization actually stands out in some of the earliest myths that we have about the invention of biological weapons. And if you can go to the third slide,
I'm having a little bit of problem here.
it won't advance.
Yeah, we're not seeing the full slide, and I'm not sure why I am not getting it. So hold on 1 minute. Why am I not seeing the full slide?
That's the full slide, that's the first slide.
Right, but we're not seeing the full slide on our screen here.
It doesn't show slideshow or,
It does, but it shows
there,
all
there
of
it is. That's the second one. That's
the,
perfect.
right, well, not really, because we are not seeing the full thing over here. Is there somebody who
Oh,
could help me with this?
I'm seeing it.
Is there anyone that could help with this? Um, could you come up and help? I'm not sure why I'm not getting this.
Always shows it up different. Your screen.
Yeah, I know. Let me get out of it and then come back in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Hold on 1 minute.
I think my talk will still fit in the time limit.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, not a problem. We will try to get it. Uh,
It goes to the second slide on my screen.
Yeah, but in our screen, we only see a small version at the top
Oh,
and all of the rest of your slides at the bottom.
oh,
Yeah, not sure why this is happening this way. We may have to just move forward with it and look at it in this way. I don't know what else I could do.
does it show all the slides? I can just talk about which slide I'm talking about, or,
Yeah, we'll just have to probably do that. Could you, whoever is talking could try and. I got into some kind of mode and it's not coming up.
There it is. Okay, that's slide 3 and 4.
Yeah. It's not, yeah. It's not showing full screen. Oh, okay, thanks. Okay, is that the one we on now?
Yes,
All right, good.
because I'm going to start with mythology, and this is
All
an
right.
ancient Greek vase painting, and the concept of creating poison weapons is deeply embedded in ancient Greek mythology, and that's where I'm going to go now. In fact, our word toxic comes from the ancient Greek word for bow and arrow, and we're going to find out why. This is shows Hercules battling the Hydra monster from about 500 BC, and it was Hercules who started it all. In his second labor, Hercules set out to slay the Hydra monster. It's a poisonous serpent with many heads and fangs, all dripping venom. And his brute strength and ordinary weapons were useless against this monster. Every time he chopped off one head, 2 more grew back. And here you can go to the next slide. And to destroy this 100-headed monster, Hercules first resorted to fire. He tried to use a torch to try to cauterize each neck before it could generate more heads. But the Hydra's central head was immortal. You couldn't destroy the central head. So Hercules hacked off the head and buried it alive deep in the ground. And then he placed a huge stone over the spot. And in antiquity, Greek travelers used to point out a big boulder on the road to Corinth as the place where Hercules had buried the Hydra monster's horrible, indestructible head. And they imagined it still oozing venom underground, but at least it was trapped under the earth. Then, after destroying the Hydra, Hercules dipped his arrows in the venom of that monster. And with that act, Hercules invented the first biological weapon described in Western literature. But that's not all there is to that myth. Remarkably, the ancient myth of Hercules' invention of poison arrows goes on to predict all the practical and ethical dilemmas that surround the use of chemical and biological weapons ever since earliest times. And the next slide can show us some of that symbolism of the Hydra. The monstrous Hydra with its ever multiplying heads. I think that's a really fitting symbol of the proliferating problems that are created by biochemical agents of death ever since the first Greek myth about inventing biological weapons. The ancient Greeks understood that by their very nature, chemical and biological weapons tend to be very difficult to control for the users. Like the Hydra's heads, the problems multiply, they proliferate, and the weapons seem to take on a life of their own, and the potential for friendly fire, blowback, and collateral damage is always looming. In the Greek myth, Hercules' invention of poison arrows set in motion a chain of unintended consequences. His new weapons accidentally maimed and killed several of his best friends. There was a famous battle against the centaurs in Greek myth, and one of Hercules' toxic arrows pierced his oldest friend, the kindly old centaur named Chiron. And the next slide, please. And the pain was so ghastly for Chiron that he begged the gods to let him trade his immortality for a quick death. The next to die in that battle was another friendly centaur, a friend of Hercules himself. While Hercules was trying to help Chiron, this young centaur curiously picked up Hercules' quiver of toxic arrows, and one of those arrows slipped out of his hand and nicked his leg. That was just a scratch, but this centaur also died a gruesome death, and here's yet another unintended victim of Hercules' poisoned arrows. In the tragic chain of events in the myth, Hercules himself was the ultimate victim of his own toxic weapons. He died by secondhand Hydra arrow poisoning. His wife unwittingly soaked his shirt in the poisoned blood of one of the centaurs who had been shot with a Hydra arrow. She thought it was a love potion, but it was actually poisonous. And the next slide shows Hercules dying as he's trying to tear away the shirt that was soaked in hydra poison. In the Greek myth, just before he died, Hercules passed along his quiver of poison arrows. He had trusted that quiver of poison hydra arrows to his young friend, the great archer Philoctetes. Next slide, please. And that shows Hercules on his funeral pyre, handing over the quiver of poison arrows to another archer, Philoctetes. But the biological weapons brought suffering to that warrior as well. On his way to the Trojan War, Philoctetes dropped one of those poison arrows on his foot, another friendly fire accident. The wound was extremely painful, and it festered, and it just got worse and worse, an unhealing wound that gave him so much pain. This incident right at the start of the Trojan War was taken as a very bad omen by the Greeks, and Homer and other writers tell us that the Greeks abandoned their wounded companion on a desert island, and they continued on to the Trojan War without him. The next vase, the next slide shows an ancient Greek vase from about 450 BC showing the young archer stranded on the desert island with a never-healing wound in his foot. So this myth seems to present a moral lesson of poetic justice, just like Hercules, who died by his own poisoned weapons. Now this young archer, who intended to use poison arrows against the Trojans, himself suffers a terrible wound from his own arrow. And the myth says that after surviving 10 years of torturing pain on that desert island, Philoctetes did finally arrive in Troy, where the war had been dragging on for decades. He was cured of his festering wound by Greek doctors, and in the myth of Homer's Iliad, the Trojan War, the expert archer began killing Trojans with his bow and arrow. So the ultimate Greek victory at Troy, as described by Homer and other authors, was thanks to a quiver full of hydra venom arrows. Now, another ancient author, Quintus of Smyrna, explicitly described the poisoned arrows that were used by both sides, the Greeks and the Trojans, in his epic poem, The Fall of Troy. They give strong hints that projectiles on both sides were poisoned with snake venom. Snake venom, if snake venom gets into your bloodstream, that brings an agonizing death. Or if you survived, a never-healing infected wound, just as described in the myth of Philoctetes. And we have yet another mythical friendly fire accident, and that's the story of Hercules' own son, Telephus. Telephus suffered an accidental injury on his way to fight in the Trojan War, and that happened when he tripped and fell against the spear that was carried by the great hero warrior Achilles. And Telephus's wound never healed either. Telephus suffered for years, just like Philoctetes. And this myth suggests that even the noble Greek champion Achilles treated his spear with some kind of poisonous substance. And if you think about the myth of Achilles himself in Homer's Iliad, Achilles doesn't die on the battlefield a noble death. He died by an arrow that struck him from behind in the heel. And if you know the story of Achilles, that was supposed to be the only vulnerable place in his body. But now if you really think about that story, the detail is a strong hint that that fatal arrow must have been steeped in poison, because normally a wound in the heel, that would be a superficial injury, unless the point delivered poison into Achilles' vein. Now in Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, the wily hero Odysseus used poison weapons. He was a master of unconventional warfare. Odysseus was an archer, and Homer in the Odyssey describes Odysseus traveling to western Greece in search of a poisonous plant called hellebore to poison his arrows. And in the story by Homer, the local king of that land strongly criticizes Odysseus for using toxic arrows instead of having honorable face-to-face combat. There were a great variety of poison plants known to the ancients that you could use to poison your weapons. Arrows were sometimes treated with hellebore, or highly toxic monk's hood. Next slide, please. And like hellebore, aconite is a common plant in a lot of people's gardens today. So you want to watch out for those two plants that were used to poison weapons in antiquity, monk's hood and hellebore. Well, Homer's passage about Odysseus poisoning his arrows reveals the ancient tension about what was fair in warfare. In a traditional warrior society like Greece, honorable face-to-face fighting with swords or spears was highly valued. But the Greeks and also the Romans, they admired, as we know, creative, sneaky tactics like those thought up by Odysseus. I mean, Odysseus invented the Trojan horse, and he poisoned his arrows, and he's another hero. So you can see that tension about poison weapons that early on in myth. Now, so far, I've only focused on mythical stories because they show us that the idea of making biological or chemical weapons is extremely ancient. Goes back to 3000 BC or earlier. But they also demonstrate the complex attitudes towards weapons that deliver hidden poison or take unfair advantage of heroic warriors. As the myths show, biological and chemical weapons tend to destroy innocent bystanders, and they can suddenly turn against you or your companions. And besides collateral damage, they cause suffering far beyond what a traditional warrior could expect on the battlefield. And if you think about it, one doesn't even have to be a skilled archer to use poison arrows. Just a mere nick or scratch would kill or cause lifelong suffering. So poison weapons canceled out the courage and skill of warriors who expected to face equally armed foes in a fair fight. Now, as I said, so far I've been talking about myths, but killing enemies by borrowing destructive forces of nature, that's not just a myth. Biochemical warfare was actually carried out, and we have it documented in ancient sources, and we have more than 50 ancient authors that provide evidence from Greece, Rome, and other places, Africa, Middle East, India, and China, that provide evidence that a remarkable array of biological and chemical weapons saw action in historical battles. Now, not all of these biochemical weapons fit the strict modern definitions of biological or chemical warfare that we use today. Next slide, please. And if we just take a minute to think that these historical accounts, some of them may be based on what actually happened. Some of the stories may be legendary, but they still represent the earliest evidence we have of the intention to carry out biological and chemical warfare. And also they describe the principles and the actual practices that later evolved into our modern biochemical weapons. So let's just look at some definitions. Biological weapons are based on viable living organisms, such as snake venoms, plant poisons, or germs that can multiply in the body and then increase in fatal effect. Deploying animals and insects, I want to point out, can also be seen as another category of ancient biological warfare. And these are precursors of zoological and entomological weapons research that governments are pursuing today. And what about chemical weapons? Chemical weapons include things like poison gases, choking and blinding clouds of smoke, combustible materials that are unquenched by ordinary means. And when I say that, some of you are probably already thinking about Greek fire. The next slide, please. And that's a famous example. Greek fire, the Byzantine chemical incendiary weapon invented in the 7th century AD. The formula is lost, but we know that the recipe included naphtha, sulfur, and quicklime. Greek fire was an ancient version of modern napalm, which is based on those same ingredients. The complex delivery system of Greek fire, naval weapon, is also lost to us. Somehow, more than 1,300 years ago, people figured out how to distill naphtha, which is very volatile and dangerous. They added accelerants like sulfur and quicklime, and then they stored it under pressure on ships, and then they were able to propel it through nozzles at enemy vessels. This was a very dreaded weapon in antiquity. And the next slide, please. We have a much earlier chemical weapon, which was a choking, blinding cloud of caustic dust. And it also depends on quicklime. Ancient historians report that this weapon was deployed by the Romans to defeat enemies in Spain in the 1st century BC. The dust was finely powdered limestone, quicklime, which causes corrosive burning on contact with moist membranes in the eyes, nose, and throat. So the effect is similar to tear gas. And we know that this same lime dust technique was used in ancient China. And I just want to point out that the use of this weapon requires favorable winds to avoid blowback and self-injury, and always a problem with chemical and biological weapons. One of the earliest historical instances of a poison gas. Next slide, please. This was described in the 5th century BC by the Greek historian Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans during that war attacked the city of Plataea by creating a gigantic fire outside the city walls, fueled with pine resin, which is turpentine basically, and they threw in large lumps of sulfur, large clods of sulfur, and they created a gigantic bonfire. The result, toxic sulfur dioxide gas. And this same gas was used in Italy and Persia against besieging armies in antiquity. I found many other recipes for making toxic smokes and clouds of corrosive dust in ancient Chinese, Indian, Greek, and Roman military handbooks. The sheer variety of biochemical options in antiquity, it's pretty staggering. When I started my research, I did not think I would find this much evidence. Besides arrows soaked in snake venom, use of germs, plant poisons, ancient armies also poisoned the enemy's water supplies with deadly toxins. We know this was done by Julius Caesar, for instance, and several Carthaginian generals in antiquity in their wars against the Romans. The earliest documented case of poisoning a water supply with poison plants, this happened during the first sacred war in Greece against a besieged city near Delphi, and this happened in about 590 BC. And in that case, several ancient sources tell us that the poison that they used was hellebore, which is that powerful plant toxin that I mentioned earlier. This was actually used during a religious war in 590 BC. And this tactic, of course, harmed all of the men, women, and children that were trapped inside the city, not just the soldiers who were fighting the battle. It's another liability or dilemma of using biological and chemical weapons. The next slide, please. Alexander the Great and his men encountered a simple but devastating unconventional chemical weapon in the 4th century BC. They were besieging the Phoenicians, who were manning the city of Tyre. That's now in Lebanon. The Phoenicians came up with a very inventive chemical weapon. They gathered sand from the desert and heated the sand in shallow bronze bowls, and then they catapulted the red-hot sand down onto Alexander's besieging army. And ancient historians describe the ghastly scene as the hot grains of sand burned into the soldiers' flesh. This is a primitive burning shrapnel, and it anticipates the lethal deep burns that are inflicted by modern thermite or white phosphorus bombs, which I may add have been used in that same geographical region in modern times. Well, I've just given a partial list of the many ways that nature was weaponized in the ancient world. And all these tactics and more, some of them rather crude and simple, but others fairly sophisticated, were reported in the histories of Greece, Rome, India, and China. All these places have military treatises that talk about how to make these weapons and how they were used. And I point out that you can notice that all of these weapons and strategies were conceived of and used without modern scientific knowledge. All you really need is experience, experiments, observation, careful observation, some diabolical creativity, and a willingness to resort to unfair weapons that are fashioned out of whatever natural resources you have at hand. But as you can imagine, wielding weapons based on lethal poisons, volatile chemicals, wind-borne smoke or gas, unquenchable flames, virulent pathogens, toxic creatures like snakes and insects, unpredictable animals like war elephants, all of those things pose dangers not just to the victims, but also to the perpetrators themselves. And this boomerang threat is just what the ancient Greek myths warned about. And moreover, as I've mentioned, in any culture that values bravery and military training, toxic weapons were often viewed as the equivalent of cowardly ambush. It doesn't seem very brave or honorable to use toxic weapons. Still, we know, as we've seen, those same warrior cultures, they also admire some sneaky ruses of war. So despite a general sense that biochemical weapons were cruel and somehow dishonorable, we have lots of writings about that in all those cultures, they were sometimes rationalized to be used in certain circumstances. And the next slide, please. This slide shows that the ancient justifications will sound very familiar to us today. When you're outnumbered or facing troops that are superior in skill or bravery or technology, biochemical strategies can give you a real advantage. Desperate cities under siege often resorted to such options to try and protect themselves against invaders or besiegers. Sometimes generals and commanders ordered biochemical strategies out of frustration with long sieges and stalemates, or if they wanted to avoid casualties and the uncertainties of fighting a fair fight. It was an expedient to use poison weapons. And last but not least, holy wars or religious wars actually encourage the ruthless killings of civilians as well as soldiers. Whenever a population is identified as uncivilized barbarians or somehow less than human, then that encourages using inhumane weapons against them. In the ancient world, I found that poison arrows were by far the most popular biological weapons in antiquity. The next slide, please. A vast variety of substances from poison plants that we've heard of, hellebore, aconite, and many others, and snake venom were used, but I've also found instances where stingray spines were used to poison arrows. Some peoples in Africa used toxic insect guts to poison their arrows. I mean, the ingenuity is amazing. All of these have been used around the world to poison projectiles. I learned that in ancient Gaul, the Gaulish warriors or Celtic warriors were known to tip their arrows with a plant called henbane, and they also used hellebore, but that they had antidotes ready to treat accidental self-injury, to avoid the problems that were encountered by the mythic heroes. So people really thought about the blowback and self-injury problems. Pliny the Elder, the great naturalist from Roman times, remarked that the ancient Romans used to dip their spears in deadly nightshade, and he points out that the old Latin name for this plant actually means spear poison. Well, the most dreaded biological warriors of antiquity were the Scythians. These are the nomad horse people, archers of the steppes. They lived around the Black Sea in what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, all the way to Mongolia, and actually all the way across Asia to China. Not only were these people expert archers and horse riders, but their arrows were poisoned with Scythicon, the notorious Scythian arrow poison. And the Scythians, we hear, the Greeks and Romans tell us, that they dipped their arrowheads into deadly snake venom. They had many choices of poisonous snakes in their lands. Next slide, please. Here's some of the snakes they could have used: the sand viper, the steppe viper, the Caucasus viper, and the European adder, all deadly poisons. Facing a hail of arrows shot by Scythian warriors, that would have been especially harrowing for Greeks and Romans and other enemies who faced them. And I say especially harrowing because the Scythicon recipe was much worse than just mere snake venom. We have many ancient Greek and Roman historians who tell us that the Scythians mixed up a nasty concoction that included not just snake venom, but the bodies of dead poison vipers mixed with human blood and animal dung, and they put it in a leather bag and let the mixture putrefy in the ground over several months. Now, a slight scratch from one of these arrows would bring a really agonizing death, or if you're lucky, slow torture from a wound infected with gangrene and tetanus and who knows what else. Now, I'm just thinking some of you were feeling a little queasy right now. Just reading or hearing about these ancient poison arrow recipes today makes us feel really uncomfortable and queasy. And I want to point out that reaction was exactly the intention of poison arrow makers in Scythia and other lands. Just dipping arrows in pure venom would be deadly enough, right? But soaking them in nasty poisons and then broadcasting the disgusting recipes and symptoms to your potential enemies, that's an important psychological aspect of biological and chemical warfare in antiquity and today. So the very idea of facing arrows dipped in venom or poison would have been a horrifying prospect, and the Scythians made sure that the Greeks and Romans knew their recipes for those poison arrows. Whether they did it or not, they have broadcast the recipes. Well, during the Roman Empire, the Roman armies were totally unprepared for the inventive biological tactics and chemical incendiaries that were used by fortified cities that the Romans besieged in Mesopotamia, Persia, and the countries that are now Iraq. Now, for the Romans in the ancient period, petroleum and naphtha were mysterious, rare substances, occasionally used for religious rituals, maybe some magic tricks by magicians back home in Italy. No one knew much about petroleum. But in Mesopotamia and Iraq, since about 900 BC, those ancient people had found myriad uses for the sticky, flammable petroleum that seeped up from the desert sands, and those uses included military applications. There's a lot of evidence for that in both art and literature. Next slide, please. And here's a painting of some soldiers from either Greek or Roman lands observing Persians collecting naphtha from a flaming oil pool. The naphtha is volatile and it can burn for centuries, actually. Petroleum fire was first used against a Roman army in the 1st century BC during the Roman wars in the Middle East. Roman historians struggled to try to describe this new chemical incendiary. According to Pliny the Elder, the naturalist from the 1st century BC, he wrote that the defenders of Samosata, a city that lies between modern Turkey and Iraq, that they had a secret weapon against the Romans. Pliny wrote that it was, quote, a flammable mud that exudes from nearby pools. Once it's ignited, marveled Pliny, it's impossible to quench with water. You can't put out this fire with water. The Roman siege of Samosata in that city in 68 BC, the Roman siege failed miserably because the Samosatans poured naphtha, burnt naphtha onto the Romans, and the soldiers' armor and bodies melted in the intense heat of these liquid flames. And that same year, another Roman historian reported, this time it was Diodorus, reported that another city on the Tigris River, same area, the barbarians, quote, have an extraordinary chemical that burns up whatever it touches, and it cannot be extinguished, unquote. These cities were pouring flaming, flowing naphtha onto the Romans, and the streams of liquid fire consumed the Roman siege machines, mostly made of wood, and incinerated the soldiers themselves. Well, now I'm just going to talk about a combination of corrosive fire and venomous creatures that was deployed against the Romans in AD 199. Yet another attempt to control the Asian provinces. The Roman Emperor Septimius Severus twice attempted to besiege Hatra, a stronghold in the desert of northern Iraq, not far from the town of Mosul. Next slide, please. These are the ruins of that fortress that the Romans attempted to take over. The fortress controlled the spice routes from Asia to the Mediterranean, and they wanted control. But the people of Hatra were holed up in their fortified city, and they planned their defense as the Roman legions advanced across the desert. Their first weapon was chemical, burning naphtha from the nearby oil fields. The Roman historians reported that some sort of remarkable sticky substance enveloped the Roman army in searing flames as they were preparing their siege, and this forced the Emperor Severus to retreat. But he tried to regroup and planned another attack. But Hatra had another defense, biological this time. Next slide, please. As the Emperor Severus prepared his second attack, the people of Hatra went out into the desert and collected hundreds of stinging scorpions from that desert. And the desert of Iraq has giant scorpions, which are very deadly and very common. They packed those scorpions into clay pots, sealed the pots, and waited for the Romans. Scorpions were deeply feared in antiquity. So let's just imagine the scene at Hatra. Just as the Romans were about to breach the city walls, putting their ladders up against the walls and bringing their siege engines, the defenders of Hatra above began hurling down clay pots filled with live scorpions. As the pots shattered on the soldiers' armor, the quote, the rain of hideous insects fell onto the exposed skin of the soldiers. And this is from the Roman historian Herodian. And he says that the scorpions dig in, stung, and bit the men. Severus retreated again. Just think of the terror effect. It must have been horrifying. No matter how many men were actually stung, it doesn't matter. Just people were so terrified by the fact that scorpions are falling on them. These combined defense tactics, chemical fire of naphtha and scorpion grenades, caused Severus to give up his siege in less than a month for fear, quote, his entire army would be destroyed by the biological and chemical weapons of Hatra. Now, this is a very rare thing for a Roman army. They usually stuck out their sieges, and they usually won, even if it took years. And we can say that the desert fortress of Hatra remained independent for another few centuries until some other army from the east actually overran them. Well, I'm about to end now and close up, and I will admit that contemplating the history of turning so many destructive natural forces into insidious weaponry, it's a rather melancholy endeavor. The evidence from ancient myth and history really shatters the notion that there was ever a time when biological and chemical warfare was unthinkable. The next slide, please. I will say that the evidence that I found studying all these cultures that used biological and chemical weapons, it shows that doubts about the use of such weapons arose as soon as the first archer dipped his arrow in poison. And I think that's a reason for hope. Every ancient culture that wrote about biological and chemical weapons, they also express moral questions about their use. And as long as such unscrupulous weapons arouse moral criticisms, I think we can hope that biological chemical warfare can be constrained. Thank you.
Okay,
And I think
question.
that uses up your time, I think.
We could entertain a few questions.
Okay. Happy to take questions.
Hi again. I had a question concerning Greek fire. I know like in some media it's shown in like unnatural colors, but I noticed like in your picture it just was a normal color. Is that
Yes,
like historical
I
at all?
think Hollywood likes to make it really spectacular, and so they make it kind of. I think you're thinking of it really a really terrifying green color, a sort of
Yeah.
day glow neon green color, and I think that that's probably a Hollywood addition. On the other hand, if you add things like sulfur and maybe other chemicals. I'm not sure. We don't know exactly what the color of original Greek fire was in the 7th century AD. We're not sure what the color was. The one illustration that we have of Greek fire comes from a medieval illustrated manuscript, and it shows orange and yellow flames. So all we know is that this weapon was the most dreaded weapon in by the Byzantine and medieval era. If all an invading navy had to say was that we have Greek fire, and often their enemy would surrender or give up. So it was terrifying, and I think Hollywood's done a good job of showing how terrifying it was. Thank you. It's a good question.
So on the fifth slide, you had Hercules on top of a modern tank.
Let's see what I have here.
Was-
That was, it shows, it just shows a general, just an ancient Greek warrior facing a tank that has Hydra heads on top of it. That was an illustration made by a newspaper illustration that reviewed my book, Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs, and I just thought it was a really good symbol for biological and chemical weaponry. All the problems and dilemmas that proliferate and multiply.
So did you do or have you done any research on like these chemical and biological warfare in like the Bible? Because there's report in the Bible of many, wars and stuff.
I have found, I remember that I mentioned that the Romans were unfamiliar with petroleum or naphtha because they only knew it from hearsay or a few magical tricks if a bit of petroleum had been imported to Italy. But I did find that I think there are two instances in the Old Testament, and I forgot exactly which of the old prophets showed off magical tricks that were meant to show the power of their God, Jehovah, to unbelievers, and they used petroleum fire or naphtha to create an unquenchable, extremely bright fire. Maybe you can tell me which of those two prophets that it was.
I can't recall.
I will email it to you.
Yes,
because
please do. That would be
it's
very
really
interesting.
interesting. It's a very interesting use of just the awesome power of naphtha to convince one of them. Oh, it was the prophet that was talking with Nebuchadnezzar.
Mhm.
He showed off a trick with a light, and I will email you both of those, and you could share it with your class. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's a good question. And I
What
don't know,
about,
I don't know if there are other instances of, I can't think of any poison weapons used in either the Old or New Testament described in the verses. But if you have any, I'd like to know about them.
oh, piqued my interest in this topic. So,
It's something
yeah.
to look for, especially since we know that these two prophets had access. Of course, they were traveling around Mesopotamia, and so one of them one of them used the trick in Jerusalem. I can find the exact references, so I just recently read them, but it slipped my mind exactly where to find them in the Bible, and I'll email that to you.
What about the Crusades?
Oh, yes. Well, during the Crusades, as I mentioned, Greek fire was one of the most feared weapons, and it was the Byzantines who had the weapon. So we know that the Byzantines used Greek fire to defend Istanbul and also in other naval battles in say, 7th century through the Middle Ages. So the recipe was lost sometime in the end of the Middle Ages. So there were definitely many battles fought with Greek fire. And it started as a naval weapon, but pretty soon the Islamic forces were using Greek fire in sort of blow torches or land battles. They had whole army troops in asbestos armor, which they got from Afghanistan. You could mine asbestos in Afghanistan. They were in asbestos armor, and they actually deployed what was originally a naval weapon, Greek fire, naphtha, quicklime, and sulfur. They were able to aim that at land armies. And there are a lot of instances of that. And if you find my book, Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs, in the last chapter, summarizes many of the battles that used Greek fire. So that should satisfy that question about the Crusades. The people of Europe who went to the Middle East really feared Greek fire, both in from ships, and from land forces.
I I don't know if you've kind of evaluated, warfare. With this question, I wanted to see which ancient army was like the most ferocious, the most unscrupulous, in your opinion?
Well, what's interesting to me is that every culture that wrote about these unscrupulous weapons, there were also historians who criticized the use. But I think the most impressive to me were the military treatises from ancient India, from books called one of them is called the Artha Shastra, which is a military treatise that gives, I would say, hundreds of recipes for toxic weapons, from poisoning wells and water supplies to poisoning projectiles, and to making toxic and blinding smokes and gases. And it's just really shocking that they have so many recipes. Now, who knows how many of them were used? But within that treatise, which was probably written by many different authors, not just the person it's attributed to, there are some cautions that, well, first you should win the hearts and minds, or honorable warfare is always best, but sometimes we have to use these weapons. So I would say that in ancient India, they really had command of a huge array of toxic weapons.
Well, I think we're gonna wrap it up.
Okay,
We could all give Dr. Mayer another round of applause. Thank you so much.
thank you. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be in touch with you. I'm interested in following up.
Okay, I'm happy to.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye. The thing is like completely different. Oh, she left already?
Yeah, she left pretty quick.
No, I'm talking about Brenda.
Oh, Brenda. Yeah, she did leave pretty quick.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened this. Okay. Okay.